This is your host, Jane Hales, and welcome to today's episode of .Team Talks, a podcast all about driving transformative growth through innovative and everyday automation solutions. Let's dive in and start to tame your tech today. For this episode of Power of Diversity Insights from Boldly Inclusive, we explore how diversity drives success in business and life. Join us as we hear from Christina about leaders and change makers who are embracing inclusion to create innovative solutions. Welcome. We have Christina Sackeyfio with us, all the way from Toronto in Canada. So different time zones, but we're all brought together by technology. So thank you so much for joining us. Christina has an illustrious career in academia as well as owning her own businesses, and is a social impact professional. You describe yourself as an educator, strategist, and engagement professional. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
As a social impact professional, tell me about what that title means. How did you get to that position?
When we're thinking about social impact, we're just thinking about the issues that we might see in our society and how we can make real, meaningful, applicable changes. So in terms of how I got to this space, I often think about my childhood, actually, very interestingly enough. Seeds were planted very young. I remember when I was in grade 6, so UK, I think that's year 7, I had a teacher, very lovely teacher, mind you, but the teacher often picked the boys. Put their hands up, pick the boys first. Needed some help, pick the boys first. And myself and another friend of mine, another burgeoning feminist, recognized this, and we decided, you know what? Let's put together a petition. We'll get all the girls to sign it. We'll give it to the teacher, and we'll try to make sure that the teacher starts to incorporate us a little bit more, really include us in meaningful ways. So we did that. And I remember we were a little bit nervous when the teacher called all the girls outside to speak to us. We came forward and said, we were the ones who did this. And she said, you know what? Actually, I'm really sorry. I did not realize this was something that I was doing. And I'm going to promise to you I'm going to do better. And by that afternoon, she was picking the girls for gym class, to help set up things. And we realized at that moment that change could be real, right? We're looking at it from a gender standpoint as young people, but it was something that really stuck with me and informed the career that I've developed at this point as well. So in terms of how I specifically got here, I studied critical integrated anti-racism, long word. When it comes to dealing with social issues, you have to look at it from the standpoint of race to make sure everyone is included. You also have to layer that on other integrated identities, gender, disability, class as well, in order to ensure that we're really reaching everybody when we want to solve these really challenging, critical social issues. So I was able to work in the grassroots sector in that space, worked for a really cool organization called Literacy Through Hip Hop. And from there, everything that I've done from my career, whether it's in the nonprofit space, working in financial empowerment, working in child protection, to the work that I've done in for-profits, has always been around social impact.
Wow, that is a very big task to take on, to change the world. Phew. Do you know, or can you feel whether you're making progress on such a big goal such as that? How do you get a feel for that?
Yeah, so it's really interesting, actually. I think evaluation, and as we are talking about processes today, evaluation becomes very critical in these situations. Traditionally, in the social sector, the historical tendency has been to focus on outputs. So how many people are going through programs, right? How many people are completing programs? How many people are being reached and are informed that these programs exist? Nowadays, especially when we're looking at it from a social innovation, social impact standpoint, the measures of success are a little bit different, right? So now we're thinking ahead and saying, what does success look like? And thinking about it from the people who are on the receiving end, so the end consumers, and how does their life get better? What decisions are they able to make? What plans are they able to put in place that they're able to achieve? So we look at what changes in their lives, and then we set up evaluation processes. So thinking about content, thinking about the distribution, thinking about how we go about these processes of measuring success in very different ways as well. So ultimately thinking about how we're actually making meaningful impact is really in the stories of the people who are reached at the end of the day and what changes for them.
Okay, so almost a qualitative perspective in terms of the impact, the stories you mentioned, as opposed to it being X%, which we would have done conventionally.
Yeah, so I think it's actually a little bit of both now. I think that traditionally the emphasis has been on quantitative. Nowadays, we're looking a lot more at marrying the quantitative and the qualitative as well.
Wow, that's quite a lot of things to juggle, structured and unstructured data, isn't it? Wow.
Yes.
I've got to go back to the mention of your literacy hip hop. My mind is buzzing in terms of what a positive outcome would be there. Is it song? Is it tell me more before I say the wrong thing.
No, you were right on track. So with literacy through hip hop, it had previously been a summer program, but it had expanded to a full year program during the time that I joined. It's very interesting because at the time I was doing my research on the impact of hip hop culture on young people and their ability to really feel included from not just a racial standpoint, but also from a cultural standpoint, and see themselves reflected in school systems and the like. So this was literally my thesis come to life.
Wow.
So when we think about success in that standpoint, first off, I have to speak a little bit who was in the program. We were reaching out to young people who were considered risk of dropout, right? Or push out, if you will. So these are kids who perhaps were coming from vulnerable communities. So maybe they were living on lower incomes. In some cases, they were kids who perhaps might not be living in lower incomes, but perhaps might be in areas that we recognize as having trends showing that kids were not always successfully completing their studies. So we were reaching out to these specifically vulnerable communities and saying, would you be interested in testing out this program? We want to pilot it. We want to see whether this is something that can be replicable and something that educators can learn from as well when it comes to doing things a little bit differently to make people feel seen and heard within classrooms. So when we think about evaluation in that sense, and when we think about what success and impact looks like, and we're certainly looking at young people who came to the program and completed the program successfully, but we're also looking at the stories that they're telling about the changes that they're experiencing. We're also seeing the engagement. At the end of each program year, we would have a little graduation ceremony, if you will, and we would have our most improved student. And often our most improved student would be kids who were a little bit quieter, but they had a lot more confidence at the end of the day and were able to speak up and to share their perspectives in ways that they perhaps might not have been before. We've had kids who would, and they would show the art that they had learned over time, where perhaps they were starting at square one and they were suddenly doing spins on their head, doing breakdancing, right? But then we're also hearing from the parents as well in gathering those stories. You know, we had a really fascinating conversation with our 11-year-old at the dinner table about gender and pop culture representation. And they said they learned it from your program. So what are those takeaways in terms of their critical analysis as well? So their overall literacy, when we're thinking about literacy through hip hop, we're also measuring that change in literacy as well.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
So that's two fantastic examples of working with the children and their parents in terms of recipients of your skill set. You do a lot of work with leaders as well, don't you? So
yes, I do.
More about that and what kind of organizations or situations those leaders are in.
So a lot of the leadership work that I'm doing presently is associated with my work at Boldly Inclusive, the work that we do there. It's really around ensuring that organizations are able to see diversity, equity, and inclusion embedded within their organizational fabric. So we want it to be not just what they do, but we want it to be involved in how they, so making decisions, implementing processes, procedures, practices, and the like. So when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, there are things that we could do on a micro level to make changes, right? It could be, what are the different tools that we're using to screen from an HR screening standpoint? And do they also reflect our values for diversity, equity, and inclusion? It could be the products and services that we deliver. Do they represent the societies that we are serving and the communities that we're trying to reach? But part of like the big stuff, the real sustainable stuff, is around organizational culture. And from that, we really need to make sure that leaders are embedded in this process of change and of growth. So a lot of the work that I do with leaders is around capacity building. So on one hand, it could be the more traditional learning and development workshops. We try to use a lot of story as part of our methodology. We also want to make sure that we use a lot of scenario-based learning as well. We also do coaching, because what happens in those learning workshops is that people's awareness tends to grow right? They tend to get a better sense of the aha moments of these are institutions and systems that I'm a part of. I might have a role in them, but what do I do next? And sometimes the coaching can help with some of the messiness of that work, but it also allows space for leaders to also be vulnerable and say, I am very nervous about this. I don't know whether I'm doing the right thing. I could be impacting others negatively. How do I manage being a leader within these spaces that honor and value cultural diversity, equity, and inclusion? So when it comes to the work with leaders, they certainly have a clear role in sustaining diversity, equity, and inclusion, but they also need to be supported too, just as much as their staff does as well.
Interesting. I mean, and I can imagine those questions are in terms of if I do this, will I impact that? So do you have some sort of long-term support that happens after the workshops that you do? Or is there where would people look for that kind of reassurance or answer to those questions when you've gone?
So usually what I always tell my clients is that they should use me as a resource. We've established a relationship in one way or another, right? But after that, the relationship doesn't need to end, right? They should know that this stuff can be hard. As a consultant in this space, I'm always constantly learning. Sometimes it does feel like the world is changing much faster than we're able to keep up with. So I do come with that sense of empathy to where they are, right? And the pressure that they have on their shoulders of feeling like they have to know everything at all times. So they can share that pressure with me. I'm here to help in that sense. But even when it comes to some of the other pieces of work, so I do leadership, learning and development as part of my core services, but I also do cultural audits, for example. I also do strategic development. And in all of those different services that I provide to my clients, I always make sure that they know that coaching is an option as well. So with some of my clients, I'm just doing monthly coaching with them just to check and make sure that they feel that they are still success oriented, goal oriented, but also feel supported so that they're not alone moving forward.
That makes sense. Interesting you mentioned audit. I mean, we do audits on platforms, hero platforms, IT platforms. When you do your audits, what are the most common things that you tend to identify? What are the most common things that people tend to forget or have an issue with that you pick up?
Oh, that's a very good question.
You're doing audits of systems, and I'm intrigued to know, what do you find comes out of the audits most often? The sort of problems that businesses tend to have that maybe they don't notice that they have? What?
So I think on one hand, it really depends on the organization, right? So when I look at nonprofits versus for-profits, for example, with nonprofits, they tend to focus almost primarily on the clients that they're serving. So they tend to look outward before they look inward. And what I end up noticing when it comes to nonprofit audits is that sometimes there are things that are happening within the staff that some of the leadership might not always be aware of. Might be some simmering concerns or tensions or issues that they might be feeling that they haven't always felt safe coming forward with, and having a third party person speak to them or to ask them these questions allows them to say, actually, this has been something that's been really stewing with me. So I think that's one thing that I find with nonprofits. I think with for-profits, it's very interesting because they often come with the reverse, right? The first thing is, we've been having a little bit of an issue with some of our staff, right? And some concerns there. How do we make sure that we're able to meet their needs? So often the focus is on the staff first, and then we're able to say, okay, now what does this look like in terms of your partnerships, right? Strategic partnerships. What does this look like in terms of your ability to connect with communities, right? So it's very interesting seeing those different dynamics. That said, I think one thing that marries both is a lot of insights around process, actually, that start to emerge. And we see that in our surveys because we have a number of steps that we go through in our audit process. We'll do surveys. We do, one-to-one interviews with staff. We also examine pretty much how the diversity, equity, and inclusion story is being told within organizations. So we have a number of steps that we go through. And one thing that we often find in terms of our feedback is that processes can be a very interesting indicator of what's happening within the organization from a DEI cultural standpoint. Do people feel that they're being consulted, that things that impact their jobs or their careers, that they're also being asked for their impact or their feedback? When you have those organizations where that's happening, there tends to be a lot more of that cultural inclusion that we see that we can continue to build on, which is always great because it's nice to have a good starting point. But then when we have those organizations where perhaps decision making happens at the top and it filters down, people tend to be a little bit more scared, right? There's a little bit more fear when processes are downloaded to people instead of allowing them to say, this is the feedback that we have, this is not working. And there's a fear-based environment in that respect. What we see is that there's lower psychological safety. So it's very interesting seeing how processes and what we're learning about processes can directly reflect what's happening in terms of the organizational culture and whether there's space for us to grow or whether we need to start off with repair and then move forward.
Interesting. And coming back to your earlier point where you were bold enough to go in grade 6 to your teacher and say, look, this is the mirror I'm showing up to you. This is what we're receiving, but you don't know you're doing it. In the organizations that are almost being given the top-down instructions and people are told that they need to go to your workshops, how well do they actually engage with what they're being told they have to engage with? If you don't want it, why would you pay attention and listen to the learnings? How do you deal with different mindsets of people that attend the courses?
Interesting question. I think that's something that many across the field are starting to really grapple with. There has been some research that has said, to be frank, that diversity, equity, and inclusion learning and development doesn't always have the impact that we want it to have. And I think part of my approach in response to that has been twofold. I think number one is that I start off with leaders, right? Because I want to ensure that we are starting off with a culture of diversity, equity, and inclusion that will filter out throughout the organization. Part of my approach has been not to start off with staff learning and development, but often to start off with leaders first and seeing where the temperature is, because that can also give some really good insights around where staff are when we're ready to take that next step and if we are ready to take that next step. So that's one thing that I do to try to mitigate that.
Okay, lovely. So almost through your business, you're focusing on other businesses, and that's a one-to-many approach.
Yes.
Yeah, so through the leadership, through the team, and then the more positive impact and, well, improvement of engagement for staff, culture, and those kind of things. So what, you mentioned you moved from one to another. Was there any particular key moment or key trigger that went, do you know what, I'm jumping out of the safety of being an employee to the wider journey of being an employer and entrepreneur? What was it that was going through your head at that time? What prompted you to do that?
Good question. So I think there were a couple of things. Yes, I did some work with for-profits, but I think nonprofit always tended to be my home base. The way that we worked was very project-based, right? So we would have a specific project. We would try to figure out what are the learnings. Is this replicable? How do we scale? We would provide those recommendations to our funder, and then we would either get funded for a phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, and the like, or the project would end and then we move on to something else. And that also meant as an employee within the Canadian context, or I'll say Ontario context at least, sometimes that meant that for those of us who are working in those projects, our contracts were also connected to those contracts as well, often. So I was between contracts. I'm observing these pieces around diversity, equity, and inclusion and how I had a perception that it could be done a little bit differently. We talk about social impact, social issues, but they exist within systems, right? They exist within organizations, right? If we talk about, disparities in healthcare, how do we make sure that our healthcare systems, that our hospitals, that, our doctors' offices have what they need to make sure that they're serving communities?
Congratulations. Well done.
Yeah, thank you.
Well done.
Thank you.
Interesting observation that you went straight back to school rather than sometimes that confidence. We need things to build our confidence, don't we?
Yes, we do.
Next step.
Yes, we do. Mm-hmm.
Well done. And I would imagine in terms of your ideal client, the people that you're working with on behalf now, would you consider them to be the enlightened minority of employers out there that have realised that they need to seek a change and they're relying on an expert to get them there? Or is it pretty widespread, would you say?
Partly, when I think about the name of the business, Boldly Inclusive, right? I think that there's definitely a space for those who might be ready for it, might be enthusiastic for it, and are ready to go in and try things that are different. Having that sense of intentionality, fearlessness about it, and saying, let's give this a shot. There's a lot more that we can do, and we can do things a little bit more intentionally in terms of what we embed in our, what we learn, what we embed, how we change, how we grow. So that's one thing that I'll say. That said, because I've worked in grassroots, because I know what it is to wring water from a rock, I also want to make sure that diversity, equity, and inclusion services and supports are also available to those organizations that perhaps aren't considered quote unquote ready, right? Where they're managing a number of different crises at any time and require a service or support that recognizes that and says, okay, we will work at your pace. We will do what needs to be done to make sure that we are moving the dial forward. So I think that I'm very well suited to be able to provide supports to both sets of organizations. I think with one, you'll have a very different experience from the other, right? But the idea ultimately in both cases is to say, how can we move at your pace so that you can take ownership of this process, and so that down the road, when you no longer need me as much, when we're just doing those every so often coaching sessions, you feel that you're equipped to move the dial forward.
That sounds great. That also sounds like an awful lot of things to juggle. Those fast-paced clients, those slow clients, that getting the next client kind of mindset. How do you manage your own mental or physical processes to be able to manage clients at different speeds, different lengths, different stages?
I think what has been super helpful for me, and I will be totally honest with you, that I didn't really think about this with as much intention as perhaps I should have until the pandemic. I didn't come into this feeling like I knew everything, but it was also very much a growing and evolving journey for me as well. During the pandemic, there were ups and downs in terms of my clients. Some of them ended up closing down, so it was like low points. And then, during that time also, unfortunately, there was the murder of George Floyd as well, the global, conversation around, racial reckoning that we were having in that movement to change. So it was ups and downs. It was sometimes you're drinking water from a hose and sometimes you're thirsty, right? So it was a little bit of everything during that time. I'll say one person that was really helpful for me was that I was able to bring on a virtual assistant. Her name is Lisa McBride. Shout out to Lisa. She's incredible. Just working with Lisa helped me to really think through processes that we can now start to embed into our work to make things easier, to make things a lot more efficient. So I think, having those solid processes, having, people that are very supportive of those processes, but also having, the ability to create space for myself to think about things differently and to challenge my own assumptions about the work that I was doing.
Interesting. That creating space, that is something incredibly important, as you say, for your own well-being as well as the growth of your business.
Yes, for sure.
Interesting that you mentioned that you brought on an assistant that helps you with your processes, because often we say do, document, delegate. So to what extent were you in the documenting it stages of things when she came on board versus the ones that she actually took it from you and reflected back to you what you were doing?
Yeah, so I would say easily, like if I think about it in terms of percentage, if I have my pie charts, right, and how much of the pie was being sent on the documenting, by the time that I connected with Lisa, I was probably easily doing about 50%, I'll put it this way, 50% documenting, 50% doing. Well, and what was the last bit? Doing documenting. Yeah, so I would say I was probably at the 50-50, but I needed about a good 75 in terms of the doing. So I really felt like I was pulling myself, apart, just trying to keep. I had a number of new clients as well, because as I mentioned, context-wise, there was a lot more demand for diversity, equity, and inclusion. It wasn't just the doing, but it was also keeping up with pieces, the relationship management pieces, the onboarding pieces, that come on to having new clients. So I would say 50-50 to start off with.
And to your point of, and then you simplify the processes, which means that it would have changed. So you were doing it that way. Upon reflection with somebody else's input, you changed it again. And that's perfectly fine. And actually, that's almost the better thing. If things do not change, that's when you've got more trouble than if things are there. But it's having that core foundation, and it's often difficult to judge to what extent it should be 100% documented versus the whole. here's the essence of what needs to happen, but you might need to use your own initiative to fill in the gaps sometimes. Yeah, it's
Absolutely. And it's interesting that you say that too, because I think that ability to stop and kind of stress check ourselves is so critical. Like when I think about entrepreneurship, it's funny. I had a friend of mine who, when I started, she'd gone off on her own. She was working independently, also a solopreneur at that time. And she was probably about a couple years ahead of me. And she said, I miss those days where I was able to create. I just feel like I'm just on a hamster wheel. And I didn't get it because I thought it meant volume of clients, that she was constantly working. But then I realized a lot of it is that documentation, that relationship management. So you need to create spaces to stop, take a look at what you're doing and say, could this be done differently or better, in order to ensure that you are giving the best to your clients and doing the best for yourself as well. This work can be tough, right? So we want to make sure we're taking care of ourselves.
okay. Now that makes sense. That makes sense. And given that you now have one member of staff on board, what are your plans for the future? What are you hoping to achieve?
So I think there's a couple of things that are on my mind right now. The organizational structure has been me working as a solopreneur, but I also have a number of different associates that I bring on for different projects. So I might bring on somebody who has an expertise in leadership, for example. I'll have somebody who does work around evaluation and we bring them in. So I'm realizing that, and similarly, even with my virtual assistant, that's the way that we're structured, is that I'm able to kind of pull her in as needed. So that's one thing that's on my mind for sure.
Brilliant, brilliant. Christina, where can people find you if they want to get in touch and learn more about what you do and what you can offer to them?
You can connect via my website, so boldlyinclusive.co. You can also just reach out to me by email directly, Christina@boldlyinclusive.co, right? Or you can also connect with me via LinkedIn as well. So just look up Christina Sackeyfio on LinkedIn and you should be able to find me there.
Brilliant, brilliant, excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time today. This has been brilliant, and I wish you all well, and I will follow your progress because it sounds fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. It's been a pleasure.
So thank you for joining us for this episode of Team Talks today. We hope you found that aha moment to help you on your journey towards automation and business growth. Don't forget to subscribe in the link below and tune in next time where we'll explore. Until then, remember to tame your tech and keep pushing those boundaries.